Дорогие коллеги, добрый вечер.
Dear colleagues, good afternoon. We are a little bit behind the schedule. We're still waiting for our foreign colleague, Sheikh Mohammad Taqi Usmani, who is already inside the building, and hopefully he's on the way to this room. As we are being told, I suggest that we get started. Take your seats. Our plan was to have the keynote from Ministry of Agricultural Ministry. First it was Mr. Levin, then it was Mr. Lebedev. Neither has come. So we'll start with a short introductory note to be made by Associate of Skolkovo Institute of Law, and who is Executive Secretary of Experts on Islamic Finance. And Medina will give a keynote presentation where we will brief you on the report that will be the subject matter of this discussion. It's a standard report that is part of the format of the HSC conference. Hopefully this will trigger some positive response from the research community. And of course, the ideas in this report are the ideas of the team of its authors and fully responsible for its content as a research entity within HSC. And this session is not so much about the text of the report and the conclusions that we are making as discussion of a fundamentally important issue: how to ensure effective Russia's presence in global food markets. In my view, this is divided into two tracks. One is the geographical aspect and dimension. The presence in the market is where to go. And the second, and no less important matter, is how to access those markets and how to fit into those markets. There are established models of global trade that most countries go by, and it is assumed that substantial share of the profits from this trade are with major traders who form an oligopoly globally, and there is an opportunity and possibility to cooperate, interact with this trader. There's an option of Russia getting integrated into the existing schemes and enhancing our trade within the schemes. But there are alternative approaches and perspectives, and one of this is in our report. It's on the electronic site of the HSC conference, and this alternative approach provides for a long-term relationship with major consumers of Russia's grain. We see these consumers in the global south or in the Middle East. These are countries around the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, countries facing serious demographic challenges of a systemic nature, with population growth, with areas which are subject to droughts. We know that already several hundred million people in this area are on the edge of famines, and famine is a real issue and growing issue given the climate change and socioeconomic characteristics of those countries. There's a high role for the governments of these countries to play, and countries that support these countries and governments in terms of food security. Food security is a basic, fundamental geopolitical risk, is a systemic issue in this region. Whether Russia can meet this demand and can meet the requirements of this region in ensuring and assuring food security? Our team's answer is yes. It is possible within the logic of long-term partnership-based cooperation, which are dealt with in detail in our report, and we will welcome feedback and criticism. The more criticism, the better, and it allows us to move forward. The scheme we are proposing is innovative, unconventional in terms of the existing players of the global food market, but it is its innovative nature that may provide a key to success, because conventional and standard models may not be as attractive as innovative ones. In 2 words about the schedule, the participants, I will skip the Sheikh Muhammad Taqi Usmani. He will come later. We have Deputy Head of Anti-Monopoly Service, Andrei Tsiganov. Andrei Tsiganov is in charge of food markets in the Russian context. The entire supply chain, value chain from production to distribution. Globally, we see that these markets are getting more and more global. We are talking about global supply chain, food supply chain, and Federal Anti-Monopoly Service is looking at the markets through the lens of global competition. Bayer-Monsanto merger case, where the HSE was actively involved, shows that the anti-monopoly analysis of the current competition in global food markets cannot be localized within national jurisdictions. It's always out of necessity a global analysis of global supply chains. We have Mikhail Orlov. Mikhail is president of Anbika group of companies involved in selection work, working both in Russia and Africa, in Zambia, particularly working closely with Egypt currently, and therefore Mikhail is the chairman of Russian-Egyptian Business Council and the Chamber of Commerce and Trade, with a lot of debate and discussion how to enhance trade with Egypt. Egypt is a major consumer of Russia's grain and worldwide too, with Rudik Eskuzhin, who is a member of the board of Afanasy Nikitin Association, created to build long-term added value chains in the food area, and not only in the Caspian Sea region, Volga-Caspian Sea, with many aspects. Mr. Rudik has gone a long way career-wise. He worked in federal security bodies in charge of Middle East. He was the representative of Bashkortostan in the Council of Federation. We also have our colleague from HSE, Evgenia Sirova, Director for Agrarian Policy of HSE and Director of a Specialized Research Institute, the Institute for Agrarian Studies. Evgenia has long been involved in agrarian studies of research of how to build agro-policy. Anna Grichenko from the Federal Anti-Monopoly Service. Anna is in charge of the area dealing with agrarian markets, actively involved in antitrust analysis and competition analysis in these markets. Our Jochen Sweeney, Professor of Economics, Director of the University of Leuven, in dealing with the European Union policy as part of political research in Brussels. Jochen is an associate member of the Center for Agrarian Studies of HSE, closely working together with our university. The way I understand Yuriev is absent because today he's actually has a successor to talk to, and Andrei Bezrukov. I skipped you, I don't know why. Your presence here is already the hallmark of this session. It was so much obvious that you are present here. You have so much presence in the room. In my subconsciousness, this was a already obvious fact. Let me formally introduce Andrei Bezrukov, a specialist in political analysis and long-term forecasting. For quite a long time, Andrew was head of a project that he created, mapping of the future, which was forecasting geopolitical processes, geopolitical situation worldwide, advising major research and commercial centers in the United States and Singapore. Today, he's head of the Association of Security Export, with many innovative entities, companies selling their products in countries, non-allied countries, so to say, not members of NATO or not members of other Western alliances, and ready to deal with a more diversified set of suppliers of sensitive solutions. And hopefully Andrei will tell us about building channels for foods that can be fit into the reality of today, and to what extent the demand for systemic security, and we see this demand in the global south and Persian Gulf countries, to what extent this demand can be met in the context of food security issues resolution. I hope I did not forget anybody. My name is Alexei Ivanov. I'm director of Institute of Law and Development of HSC Skolkovo Institute, set up jointly by Skolkovo Foundation and HSC. And Evgeny Yasin. You're not on the list, sorry. Evgeny Yasin, you're always with us. Those who do not know Evgeny Yasin, please leave the room. He is an academic supervisor of HSC University and is inseparable from HSC. When we say party, we know it's about Lenin. When we say Lenin, we know it's about Lenin. Have I introduced everybody? One other person, and that will be, and then our friend Sheikh Usmani will come in. Kirill Maladeka, our colleague, leading researcher from the Institute of Law and Economics of Skolkovo HSC, who is a co-chair of the team of this report, who did major work of drafting and organizing. So all your criticism should be directed at him. No, there are two co-authors. I was responsible for the better part of the report. Is our friend on the way, Cyril? He changed his mind. So it took him 30 minutes to get from National Hotel. Okay, then we are moving on to Madina Kaliulina. Madina, you have the floor with a brief presentation, the major points, and then when we have Sheikh Usmani, I will introduce him and will give him the floor. That's it. Salam, dear friends, dear participants. I would like to thank HSC for the invitation to come and be involved in this long-term project, Islamic finance, about the real sector of the economy. What can be more real than food? What can be more long-term than our project, our hopes, enhancing, boosting exports, us fitting our tools and instruments, building them, and we cannot apply them unless we fit them into the established tools and mechanism. In our view, that's a very long, promising area. And if we are to speak about the first international project, securities that are meeting the Islamic finance requirements that are being proposed as a major tool to attract investment, to enhance food exports. A few words about Islamic finance and why. It is no longer view for Russia. In the central bank, there's a task force on partnership banking. For 3 years, these instruments have been studied and quite in depth. There have been two interesting events. Number one, it's the real sector of the economy. It's not about speculative transactions. It's not about stock exchange games, about what we see in most derivative products, but transactions with real assets. Number one, it's an ethical component. The basis of this is people and society. In the end, whether there will be use for the people, for the state, if we talk about tackling the issue of famine, about food security, we are hitting right on target discussing this Islamic finance transactions. Number three, these are partnership tools. Always, if a party is to make a profit, is to bear a risk. And there's no notion of zero-risk transaction. It's impossible by nature. And it's a growing segment of the economy. This will be covered in further slides. The contracts underlying it is partnership relations or trade relations. On purpose, I do not use Arabic terms. There are analogs like joint venture or project-based investment or trust management or trade transactions, trade financing, advanced financing, or manufacturing by order. Advance payment financing is one option versus food supply, but not the only option. The size of the Islamic finance market and assets over the past decade, they are growing. The forecast is by 2023, this will be $3.8 trillion. This shows the share of Islamic finance in the economies of various countries. And although in Saudi Arabia it accounts for more than 1/2 of the sector of finance, the tendency is for it to grow continually. If we're in Malaysia and United Emirates, it accounts for 20%. It doesn't mean it will be the limit. It's a new sector. The first Islamic banks appeared in 1970s. It's a growing trend. And later on, looking forward, they will be more transitioning to these channels of funding and attracting funding. In Russia, we underutilize the existing potential. In the Export Association, we've discussed it so much. Starting 2011, we have seen this breakthrough where the first Islamic companies emerged in the agrarian sector. Farmer financing account for 10% only, but it's growing and promising. Although in terms of taxes and taxation, these transactions are subject to taxation that made them less competitive compared to bank financing and credit. The number of these transactions is growing.
As for where Russia is positioned here, we have about 5 financial companies, certainly not banks, because we don't have the legal environment for that yet. We have an investment fund that is operating based on these principles. It's bounded by the boundaries of the Chechen republics. We have experts, 3 experts with the international AAOIFI international experts, and the Honorable Sheikh is a representative of this organization and works with all of the Islamic companies around the world. We have two banks that are interested in opening the so-called Islamic windows, and some of the banks are moving in that direction, including Sberbank, whose representative is here, and the average income on the Islamic deposits is about 11%. And the pilot issue of Sukuk on the Moscow exchange took place in 2017, which confirms that the legal environment may not be really friendly, but it's not adverse, so transactions are possible. If we look at the world data, we will see that Russia, in many ways, is not seen here at all. If we look at the overview by Thomson Reuters that you can see on the Zavia site, there is no data on Russia. Even based on the data we've just looked at, it means that Russia is a market that is close to the international Islamic financial community. And that is why we see this scarce approach. We see certain growth points, but we don't have a single uniform functioning system, and Russia is not integrated into the world system, and therefore it is not regarded as an important player. And our goal is to use these projects to change the situation, especially given that all of the preconditions for that do exist. So what is being proposed from the standpoint of improving Russia's export of food and food products to use the Sukuk approach? The Sukuk are securities. One of them is called Sukuk Salem, and this is about supplying food against deferred payments or advance payments. In this case, the contract is securitized. The investors buy this security, thereby paying for the product, for the goods, and the right to buy the products, and so later on the investors will be able to get the good, and therefore the deal will be closed. So what are the pluses and minuses, the pros and cons of this? And we discussed this with the Honorable Mohammed Taqi Usmani. This salam is used primarily for short-term periods. If we look at the Sukuk salam in the world, how it is used, we will see that this is primarily for durations of up to 1 year. But we want to attract long-term investments, so we want to get the investment now against the supply of products in 2 or 3 years. Everyone needs food products. Egypt and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they all buy Russian grain. But will they be ready to pay for grain 2 or 3 years or 5 years in advance? And that is something that requires some subsequent discussions. And we are not going to be focusing just on this particular option, including other options. And that includes a Sukuk that is based on a joint venture. So a joint venture may be set up, and a project may be launched, a logistical and production expert type of project can be launched, and then you will securitize this project, and then you would invite investors to become partners so that they can sell those products and become partners until the date of maturity. If you look at the overall share of Islamic finances, you will see that Sukuk there occupies, as of 2017, a share of 17%, and that share is growing, with the proviso that the Sukuk only appeared in the beginning of the 21st century. What are the advantages of Sukuk as a security? You can attract several investors from various parts of the world, and later I will show that the Sukuk investors are not necessarily countries from the Orient. It could include Occidental countries, and that is a very well understood securitized instrument, and this is something that can revolve on the market, can turn around on the market. And if we talk about the Islamic financing, we, as the organizers of the issue, Russia, will have the option of selecting the most convenient model that meets the demands of our task at hand. This shows you the size of the assets. You have it all in the printouts. All of the statistics are there, and it shows here that about half of all issues are sovereign sukuks, the ones that are issued by governments, by states, or by municipalities. A fairly popular way of attracting investment. Here we're showing the volumes of issue, both on internal domestic markets and on global markets, all the way until 2017. And here we're showing the types of sukuk. And you have the variety of terms, as you can see. And it could be Mudaraba, or Murabaha, or Ijara, and Salam, or others types of sukuk. And Mudaraba is one of the options or variations of the Musharaka sukuk. That's when you have securitization for an investment product. This shows who are mainly the investors of sukuk securities. In the Middle East, we can see that they are about half of all investors. That includes Europeans, the United States, Asia, and other countries. And that was briefly an overview that I wanted to give you regarding what could be the potential outline for attracting Islamic investments in terms of exporting Russian food products. And I'm going to give the microphone back to the moderator. Thank you very much, Medina. And now I would like to introduce to you our honorable guest, Sheikh Mohammad Taqi Usmani. And if you don't mind, I will switch to English to simplify things.
A bit earlier because we wanted to not to keep people waiting long. So Medina made a presentation of the project, briefly describing main points of our report, which we prepared for this plenary session, and the main kind of takeaway points of the Medina presentation is that Russia is underrepresented in the market for Islamic financing. We're not really getting a fair share or a possible available share of this available funds in this market, and don't really employ instruments which are available in the context of Islamic financing. And there is a potential for increasing amount of funds to be directed in the agri-business sector of in Russia, as Russia can increase production of primarily grains and other food agri-produce, and this would could be supported by investors, financial investors from the Gulf or other countries where there is excessive amount of funds not really allocated in existing projects. And so we're looking forward in exploring this field in more details, and we really rely on your expertise with regard to this issue. And I just want to say a couple of words that the project itself is directing efforts of our university, of our team, into elaborating a mechanism, a sustainable mechanism of connecting international investors who work under Islamic law and Russian producers of agri-products. And this is basically the main point of the project. And now let me introduce you to the audience, and so you will have opportunity to speak and tell your take on this and your vision about potential of this project. So, Sheikh Mohammed Mufti
Sheikh Mohammed Taqi Usmani,
prominent scholar and lawyer, served for many years as a justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan. Now is a vice president of an authoritative institution of Islamic law and Islamic studies in Pakistan, in Karachi. It's a madrasa university, Jamia Darul Uloom, in the city of Karachi in Pakistan. Sheikh Mohammed is also chair of the board of the Association of Islamic Chartered Accountants in Bahrain, Manama, which is the most authoritative body for chartered accountants training and standard setting in this sphere, and also sits on boards of about 50 different banks and financial institutions, and chairs Sharia board of the Bank of Abu Dhabi, which is like Islamic Bank of Abu Dhabi. And Sheikh Muhammad is basically, I would say, #1 authority in the area of commercial Islamic law and Islamic finance in the world, referred by also like a zillion of scholars. His books are treatises and basically basis for discussion in this area. Your authority and your basically knowledge is of great interest for all of us. So please, floor is yours.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina wa Mawlana Muhammadin Khatamin Nabiyyin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. وعلى كل من تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, my dear brothers and sisters, I am really very extremely grateful for this higher school of economics, and especially to Mr. Krill, who had given me the honor of being invited in this August forum to discuss some aspects of Islamic finance that would be helpful for this part of the world to participate in the economies of Gulf states and also the other Muslim countries. I am really honored to be invited to speak on this subject, although the main theme of Islamic finance will be subject of my speech, inshallah, today to tomorrow. But in the perspective of the discussion that you are having here about the agricultural export financing, and my sister Miss Medina has very beautifully presented the Islamic modes of financing that are prevalent throughout the world. As far as agricultural exports are concerned, there was a proposal that has been given to me that Russian country can export grains on the basis of salam, and also the sukuk may be issued on these salam contracts. So first of all, we should know what salam is. Salam in Islamic law is an instrument basically provided for the farmers. So in the early days of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Medina, there was a need for the farmers to be financed by someone. So this kind of sale, that is salam, it is a kind of sale in which the investor would give the farmer the price of some goods or some fruits or some agricultural products to be delivered to him after an agreed period. For example, normally the period was 6 months or 7 months, and it was the need of the farmers to have some financing for carrying out their farming activities. for example, for purchasing seeds and and other instruments for farming. For that purpose, they used to borrow this money from the people who have money, and then they contact with him that they will provide a specified amount or specified quantity of some fruits or agricultural products after 6 months or 7 months. Normally, although it is not a part of the salam concept, but normally, practically, the price offered for this sale would be a little lower than the market price at the time of delivery. And therefore, the investor would earn some money when the products are delivered to him after 6 months or 7 months. So, and in between, the farmer might have used this money either for farming or for his day-by-day needs, their household, for his household. And after the delivery, the person who has got this agricultural product, he would sell it in the market at a higher price than the price on which he purchased it on the basis of salam. So this is, but the basic condition for the permissibility of this kind of sale, it was necessary that all the price should be paid at the time of contract, all the price. For example, a person has contracted that he will be delivered, a particular quantity of wheat. Then the purchaser must have paid the full amount of that wheat, although at a higher price, at a lower price than the market price. And at the end, there should be the delivery of wheat must take place on the agreed date. And it was not allowed to convert this wheat with any other product or any other thing. So this is the concept of salam. So it was proposed when I had a look on the project that is being proposed. I found that the idea is that the Russian country, Russian government, for example, it sells its wheat or its grains to the Gulf countries on the basis of salam, which means that all these people who purchase this grain will be paying all the price upfront, and the intended period for salam is not 6 months or 7 months or 1 year probably. It may be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, so that the Russia could benefit from this price that has already been paid, and could grow its agricultural products. So this is the idea. First of all, although there is a difference of opinion in Islamic law, whether the period of salam may be more than 1 month or more than one crop, but the point on which all the contemporary ulama or scholars have agreed is that it is not restricted to 1 month or 6 months or a crop, but it may be any period agreed between the two parties. So there is no problem if you have a salam. From Sharia point of view, it is not prohibited to have salam for a period of 3 years, 4 years, whatever. But from practical point of view, it seems to be very difficult that the smaller countries pay the full amount upfront, although at a lower price. But I don't know whether they will be agreeable to pay the full amount at the very outset. So this is one practical issue that should be faced or addressed when implementing this. But I think that if some rich countries of Gulf, for example, Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Bahrain, etc., they may be agreeable to, because they have a lot of money, and then they may be agreeable to purchase the grain for after 2 years, 3 years, to be stored with them, and then they may sell it or may send it to any poor countries, so whatever. So if there is a real and fruitful negotiation with these countries, this may be a solution to improve the agriculture export of Russia. This is one aspect. But there is another one, which is, as pointed out by my sister Medina, that there is also a concept of musharaka in Islamic law, and which can be said that it is something like joint venture. So if you have an agreement with these countries to have a joint venture for producing agriculture and then selling it to different countries, and the profit of these transactions will be shared between the two. From Sharia point of view, it is not restricted that the share of each party should be according to his investment, but it may be agreed upon by the parties that, for example, maybe 60-40, maybe 70-30, maybe 50-50, but whatever is agreed. So if a joint venture is established between Russia and these states, it may serve better the purpose in a better situation. So I would prefer this, because it really reflects the benefit for both parties. They will not have to pay some amount for an unlimited period or of 3-4 years, but they would be a part of the joint venture, and in this way they will give you money, and you can act as a partner for that. Another instrument in Islamic finance is that of mudaraba, as Sister Medina. So in this case, all the amount is from one party, and the other party only works for the business. So, and after the business earns a profit, that is shared between the two on agreed proportions. So in this case, the financing is only from one person or one party. The other party does not do anything except working for the agriculture or industry or whatever. This is a third option that may be used for this purpose. And in this mudaraba concept, you will not have to invest your money, but you acquire money on the basis that the profit will be shared between the two parties. Although, musharaka, that is joint venture, or mudaraba, have a certain point of risk for investors. Because if the business fails or if there is a loss in the business, then the loss will be shared by the investor. So, but there are some instruments through which the risk of loss may be minimized. In some cases, the risk has been minimized to the extent that it remains only a theoretical risk, and practically they cannot suffer loss. And for that purpose, the countries who provide money, either on the basis of salam, or on the basis of musharaka, that is joint venture, or on the basis of mudaraba, they may collect the money from the people by issuing sukuk. Sukuk means it's something like, certificates of investment. So these certificates may be given to the public, to those who purchase these sukuk or participate in this venture. So therefore, they may purchase it. So it will be the general public or financial institutions who would be financing the governments to enter into salam or into musharaka or mudaraba. But in the case of salam, these certificates or sukuk cannot be traded in secondary market. But in the case of musharaka or mudaraba, these sukuk may be traded in secondary market, and everybody who owns these sukuk is free to sell them in the stock exchange or over the counter. These are the summary of the project you are proposing, and I think that we will have to further study these concepts and how to implement them, and whether they will be acceptable by the countries who finance it. But I think that you can negotiate with them, and this negotiation may bring fruits, inshallah. So with these words, I seek your permission. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Sheikh Mohammed. I think it was very useful for understanding the framework of these new methods we can use to basically boost trade in Russian agricultural product in the Islamic world. And those mechanisms, they definitely underused and underutilized by Russian producers and basically by Russian state in general. So we would love to go further, starting with this discussion about methods and mechanisms, and move towards a real practical experience of some of the Russian traders and businessmen. And I want to introduce our next speaker, who is Mikhail Orlov. He's a chairman of Russian-Egypt Business Council, and also owner and president of one of the Russian agricultural companies. And also Mikhail has a different name. He also Prince Shamil. And he is a direct successor of last king of Egypt, Farouk I. So his mother was daughter of Farouk I, and so he has really rooted relations with Egypt. So, Prince Shamil, the floor is yours. Можно по-русски?
Speak in Russian. Thank you very much. Sheikh Mohammed, dear colleagues, the topic under discussion today is very broad, and with your permission, I would like to structure my brief presentation. It's more like my contribution to my discussion to two parts, and then to connect the two parts. The first part is the role of Russia in the international food markets. To provide some numbers and figures, Russia is consuming 80 million tons. Now Russia is producing about 110 million tons a year. 1 year more, another year less. So half of Russia's consumption is some excess that can be exported. But so far, Russia is an extremely inefficient grain producer. And Mr. Zlochevsky, chairman of the Russian Grain Council, says Russia's agriculture is developing despite the state's effort. There's no strategy with the Russian government to develop Russian agriculture, despite the existence of many support measures. But what is lacking is a long-term strategy that we could go by. According to my estimate, in the near 15 to 20 years, not only the total grain production will reach about 200 million tons, and Russia will not only become self-sufficient, will become a net exporter, not only grain crops, but all kinds of meat. And Russia, besides being an industrial country, not without issues and problems, and Russia is an industrial country. And from the current status of #1 net exporter, Russia within 15 years will join the top, will become one of the top 3 exporters of food ready to eat. As has been said, I'm chairman of Russia-Egypt Business Council, and Russia is #1 exporter, and Egypt is #1 importer of wheat. 23 million tons is imported by Egypt. Besides Egypt, there are such countries as Saudi Arabia, imported 74 million tons of barley, Algeria, Turkey, Iran. If you look at the maps of Russia's clients, customers, most customers are Muslim countries. Now we are moving closer to the second topic, or second part of today's topic. What is Russia's role? Unfortunately, I have to again reiterate my super criticism. Even inside Russia, we are not able to cope with Russian railways or port capacities. In terms of exports, it's not the number of tons we produce. It's not where to find customers, how to take these food crops out of the country, lacking infrastructure. The political trend is quite interesting. Is there on the diplomatic arena? Russia's president, Russia is increasingly taking a position of respect for sovereignty. Quite recently, I had quite a confrontation with the US ambassador, not to Russia, someone from the Western world, when I started talking about the difference between food security and food sovereignty. And here lies Russia's potential major role. What is needed for this? This morning, I with Hanaki, former Minister of Supplies or Procurements in Egypt. Every day, his task was to make sure that 100 million people should be left without food on an everyday basis. If you are in his office, in his chair, You understand the difference between food security and food sovereignty. If someone applies sanctions like against Russia, if someone applies sanctions against Egypt, you know what will happen within several months. So it's an important matter in itself. What role can Russia play? Russia should go beyond its borders. And I'm concerned. Yeah, there are Russia, Rift, Commonwealth, there are Russian exporters. What are the names? Cargill, Bunke, Glencore, Louis Dreyfus. These are very Russian or Slavic names. There's no pseudo-patriotism in what I'm saying, but the fact is that there are no Russian players. There used to be an attempt to create UZK, a company, and de facto it's non-existent. We all know that by the definition of its role. Why am I saying this with such confidence? It's something which is part of my everyday relations with Egypt. Why do Egypts not have the elevators, the ports across Russia? Ports being a major bottleneck. I don't understand why the UZK company or other platforms do not have major storage facilities in Alexandria or Port Said, which could ensure food security not only for Egypt but for that region as a whole. After brilliant presentation by Sheikh Mohammed and by Medina, I will not go into the process and technology. Your presentations were very interesting in themselves, but let me tell you that this is a very good technique and process, and this is something you know so much about. But I want to step back a little bit into philosophy and the philosophy of this. Russia may be too shy or not able to or not willing to take positions which it can take. Alexei, the very start of this discussion, you ask a question, can Russia be useful? Forgive my cynicism, I don't think that Russia should be useful. I think Russia should monetize, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of political influence, its advantage across the world to the maximum degree. And food gives one an opportunity to influence countries without food sovereignty, and together with them create this food sovereignty. What is needed for this is a long-term strategy, a vision, development of infrastructure both in Russia and in those countries to get integrated and together with those consuming countries create a food sovereignty. And believe me, if we assist Egypt in creating this national food sovereignty, Egypt would not be able, forgive me, would not get away from this joint effort. This potential is so great in place, and I don't see Russia running and rushing to implement it. With Ibrahim Mahlam, former Prime Minister of Egypt, I was meeting with him, and he said to me, look here, in Syria, from the point of view of military capability, you played an excellent game. But what will you do next? We need you. And Jordan, one of the key people in Jordan, yeah, Russia is doing a great job in waging a war. The only country having excellent relationship with Syria, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Egypt, and Israel. Great. Good for us. But from his point of view, Russia is always working bilaterally. And using this tool, food, can you imagine what networks we could create in this region, helping these countries create food sovereignty? With your permission, I will go over to Islamic finance. I will not compete with the previous speakers, but since not all are Muslims in this room, and it's not sufficiently said. We speak about technologies, forgetting sometimes that Islam is not only a religion or faith. It's a set of morals, of rules, regulating people's behavior not only when they pray, but every minute of their lives. And it cardinally makes a Muslim's life different from people of other faiths. In this respect, it's important to get integrated culturally. As part of the work of our business council, Russia-Egypt Business Council, we have noticed and took note how many deals are never effected because of the cultural barrier. We are selling one-day, three-day workshops called cross-cultural communication, explaining each other what differences there are in terms of body language, in terms of phrases. Islamic world is not an Arab world. Arabs are the minority in the Islamic world. One should be able to enter the world. I heard this phrase, if we apply all these technologies and techniques, we can attract money and funding. We've been saying this about Islamic financing for 20 years in the parliament, in the central bank, and I've been hearing for 20 years that Russian banking law does not allow this. It's not the problem. Before we attract Islamic funding, we should get closer to them. We should get integrated with them. And building on what Sheikh Mohammed said, a very important idea he shared, there is a confidence crisis toward Russia from the countries of the Persian Gulf. The war in Syria did change the attitude for us. Now it's a much more respectful and calm attitude. But among businesses, still there is a lack of trust and confidence, and I see it in the operation of my business council, of which I'm part, and we speak different languages, not in terms of linguistic differences, but in terms of moral rules. It would be important for Russia to create, with your assistance, Sheikh Mohammed, a platform or platforms allowing businesses to get some training, not immediately inside Russia. Use Dometov to create a big terminal. Everything is in place there. Let the grain remain on Russian players' balances, but be located there. For Abu Dhabi, Dubai finances, it is simpler to deal with the goods that are in Egypt rather than in Russia. Until now, all traders remember and recall 2010, when our borders were closed for exports, even for signed contracts. It left its traces and impact. Let's, for 5 years, think not about how to attract money and how to enter their family. I think strategically it would be a big error and mistake not to do it. I don't know in terms of percentage, 25, 23% of Russia are Muslim people. There is a fear of Islam. There's one side of Islam, which is terrible. But it's not Islam. And when we fear, we want to be a bit, to keep away. And most of our claims for export of food are Muslim countries. Alexei, I am in support of the work you do, which is important for Russia, for the Islamic world. And I'm very critical, not of the policy, but the absence of policy of the Russian government with regard to food and the role of food in the world. And I'm also critical of the attempts that have been made to attract Islamic financing, where, on the contrary, we need to go there, invest a little bit there, to give something there, to enter that family of countries and create relations of harmony, of trust. And believe me, then everything will be okay in our relations with the Islamic world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. The issue, okay, yes, let's give him a hand. Those issues that you've just raised are very important, and in our project we try to catch that tune, that note of trying to build those links. That's why we called it the Agro-Fin Bridge, a bridge that would be ensuring communication and the transfer of assets, money, grain, confidence, security. All of these are assets that form and establish a uniform space for interaction. This term, bridge, is something that we did intentionally, and we believe that we want to have this systemic integration, going away from the speculative capitalist model that dominates the world today, where, as you said, are the key players, playing the first fiddle, Cargill and Dreyfus and the others. And I think the ethics of this will be very much in line with fiqh, or the Islamic law. And to make the segue to this discussion on strategic interaction and the security of assets, I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Bezrukov and ask him this question. How can the development of this system from the geopolitical standpoint and geopolitical positioning, how is this going to contribute to the transition from geopolitics to the economy? We have not yet learned how to do this because we speak two different languages whenever we talk about geopolitics and economics, because our geopolitical presence is more than just selling and buying. What do you think about this? Thank you very much for this very profound question. I totally agree with what Mikhail has just said. Indeed, this approach is the approach that will indeed allow us to maximize the influence of the state and ensure the economic success, both for Russia and for any other country that would want to work with Russia. Let me explain to you what is the picture of the world that I see, without trying to scare you, but I am not sure if I'm going to succeed in that. The problem is that we have now gone back 100 years in time. We have reverted to about 1914 time, the period between 1914 and 1917. And if you remember what kind of period that were, let us just look at some of the main and fundamental parameters of that period. They are very similar, if not identical, to what we are observing now. We see three crises going on at the same time, and the same was true 100 years ago. They were caused by the fundamental changes in the world. And let's start by saying that that was a technological breakthrough from one technological system or platform to another. Let me remind you that it was back then that the cars and planes appeared for the first time. The second thing, point I would like to make, is that back then they were in the process of redividing the world. There were countries, major states such as France and the United Kingdom or Great Britain, and their positions were undermined by two others, Germany and the United States. Let's not forget about this, because they were the beneficiary of this all. And the third element, and maybe the most important element of what happened 100 years ago, was a very deep social crisis. And now, after the whole wave that created that crisis and the revolution, we had gotten back to those fundamental numbers. When, and again, I'm quoting the American source here, that where 1% effectively owns about 80 to 90% of the national wealth in key nations. And so the world is ready to explode as it did 100 years ago. Well, the difference is people saw rich people in those rural areas once a year, but these days everyone can see what's happening in other countries, even if you are from a very poor neighborhood, and they want to be as rich as they are. Back then and now, we could see a decrease in the quality of the ruling class. I'm not going to be quoting from Emmanuel Todd. Maybe I should, because this quote is very topical. In his book, which I think is titled Après la démocratie, After the Democracy, he was predicting Sarkozy's coming to power. And he said if the middle class is being eroded, ruling such a country without the middle class, there are only two types of people that can rule the country, either dictators or clowns. And this is something that we're observing right now. And aggravating factor now, as back 100 years ago, was the fact that the fear of war had been gone. The tensions are rising, but since people hadn't seen a war in a long time, nobody is afraid of it. And in this, at the same time, if you look at Europe back then, Europe was a platform, or rather a place where the countries would fight to solve their issues. Nowadays, everything is shifted towards the bigger or greater Eurasia, where we have been looking at over the last 10 years, the emergence of those players that had been really sitting quiet. I'm talking about such countries as Turkey or Indonesia or Iran or Saudi Arabia. These countries are no longer dependent on anyone else. Each of those countries has a very serious military and economic potential. Each of those countries has huge populations, sometimes close to 100 million. And therefore, the system is becoming even more complex and less stable. I wouldn't even talk about how unstable those systems are inside. When you see the middle class coming to the forefront, you can see the left and the right wings emerging, and you are also looking at the emergence of the public policy, and the elite cannot make their deals behind the closed door in a hush-hush manner. At the same time, what is also happening is a very serious technological shift. Digitalization as such, the emergence of everything digital and its integration into all of the aspects of our lives is something that creates a monopoly of a different kind. Monopolies like Google, which are platform-based, and as such they manage huge volumes of money, data, and people, after all. And any solutions or decisions that would result in demonopolizing such platforms are lacking. And that is what is happening not just in the area of information technologies, but also in other areas, especially the ones that are established by the oligopolic competitors. And this leads to a monopolization of everything that those players can find on the market. It is for this reason and for many other reasons that the economy finances are becoming the same sphere of competition and infighting as all of the other competitive areas that have been that traditionally. And that means that we are now going to see the emergence of new alliances once we get on board with this technological cycle. We can see this division into the technological groups or categories, and this is a very serious process, and I'd like to dwell on it a little bit longer, because this would allow me to arrive at certain conclusions that would underpin everything that this session is about. At this point in time, at this juncture, we can say very clearly that there is a certain set of systems or technologies that are system forming for those countries that exist in the digital world. They, I would say, are even sovereignty forming. If you don't control your communications, if you don't control your power industry, if you don't control your logistics, your banking sector, then that means that you are not a sovereign state. And any control over your logistics, including your logistics in the agricultural sector, is another sovereign forming factor, which is similar to your control over your cybersecurity or information streams. If you don't have it, if you lack it, the ability of the state to be sovereign is falling apart, it's crumbling, and it's endangering its survival. The Middle East, unfortunately, is the weak link in all of these processes, similar to how Russia was the weak link in 1914. There are some acute political conflicts that are raging. I'm not even going to mention those conflicts that we are aware of happening in the Middle East. On top of that, there is also a hot war, so you don't even need to ignite the situation there. And if one needs to destabilize the situation in Egypt, I mean, you just need a spark. Remember the Arab Spring in Egypt. You need a crisis that would mean that certain things are missing, and people will go out to the streets, will take to the streets because they need to survive. In addition to this, the Middle East is logistically a bottleneck. This is a transportation corridor from Asia to Europe. Secondly, it is also a migration corridor, a channel that goes from those regions that are regions where the population is growing fast. I'm talking about the areas in South Asia, but not only there, but also in Africa. And it is this region that has traditionally been the logistical corridor for migrants going to Europe. What are the conclusions that one could make based on this? But first of all, let me make three fundamental conclusions, and then let's talk about what Russia can do about this. Conclusion number one. Today, instability in the world is growing very rapidly, and against this backdrop, the value of sovereignty and security is something that is growing all the time. That means that the states, that the government or governments are ready. And how should I put it properly? I'm searching for the right word. They are ready and prepared to pay for improving their sovereignty, and they are ready to pay a good price to survive, because they know what the alternative would entail for them. The countries are concentrating to be able to exist in the new technological cycle, because we are looking at the division of the world, or redivision of the world, and people and countries are concentrating their forces to make this leap. I'm talking about Modi in India, Putin in Russia, Xi in China, and Trump in the United States. We have strong personalities coming to the helm, because only them and they can propel their nations in these kinds of developments. the nations need to be egged on to remain competitive under this environment. And the government will have to, whether it wants it or not, to completely change and rebuild its infrastructure and somehow deal with that social crisis in a similar way as they did in the 1920s, by changing their system and moving into another realm of the economy. Otherwise, the system will explode. What is going to be the role of Russia in this? Russia is already a de facto main supplier or provider of security in the Greater Eurasia area. This is underpinned by a very clear reason, because if Russia wants to survive as a competitive state, it needs to be able to get a greater market than the 140 million people of its population it is propped up by, because you cannot build a new infrastructure by relying on just 140 million, because your investment is not going to pay off. And if you invest in very serious things like they do in the United States or in China, you can rely either on advanced technologies or on the huge populations. So we'll have to create a group of our political and technological allies only to be able to move into the next technological cycle and to recoup our investments, to be able to move to yet another one. And I've been talking for too long, but I'm about to finish my short speech. And so what follows from this is that in order to create such a market for our technology and for our products, we need to ensure that we have security in the whole area around us, adjacent to us. That's the Greater Eurasia and the Far East, and rather the Middle East. And Russia, in this case, is the country that has the great competencies. We are the only one that have created the global emergency management system and saving system. I'm talking about the emergency management ministry. And it is also directly related to logistics and our abilities in that area. And Russia is the only player that has keys to all doors. Even with our enemies, we can talk quite calmly. Look at what's happening in the Middle East. So our goal is to continue the development of our nation, and to do that we need to have a market of friends that would be tied in with our economy. It's not going to be a unilateral link, it's going to be a mutual link, both technologically and logistically speaking. And what agro business can do here is going to be one of the key things here. Thank you very much, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you for your detailed presentation. In the sphere of commodities trade, food trade, Campbell, Bunge, Dreyfus are creating a digital platform, trading platform, trying to pull their effort together, not to allow anybody else. And to this, it's an interesting perspective. Yevgenia Sirova, Director for Agrarian Policy of the Research Institute, HSE, Higher School of Economics. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I've been invited to discuss Russia food exports, and we are discussing slightly other matters. I wonder if my presentation is relevant. Alexei Ivanov, introducing me, said I've long been involved in agriculture. I've been involved in agriculture for so long that what we have been told about Islamic lending is been in existence in Russia is called commodity loan since '92. It's not interest-free. There was fuel or grain provided, and you were to supply your grain at a reduced price. It was called interest-free loans, but as we calculated, if the agriculture producer had taken a loan from a bank, it would have been cheaper for the producer. Nothing is new under the sun. In terms of the essence, food exports and more about economics than political issues in which I'm not an expert. Today, we see that there is a cardinal change of agrarian strategy. Mikhail Orlov said that we don't have a strategy. From the point of view of written strategies per capita, we may be #1 in the world. We have 5, 6 strategies a year. What we lack is strategic vision. I agree with you totally. We are catastrophically lacking strategic vision. We always are looking at our feet, not to stumble, but sometimes one should look over the horizon, not to lose one's way. The doctrine of food security of 2010, its major point is import substitution and food security and food independence. I've worked for 12 years at FAO, at the UN. In the doctrine that we adopted in 2010, it says that FAO says that food independence is part of food security. Let me tell you officially, FAO had never said anything like this. On the contrary, FAO believes that FAO independence is harmful for food security. That's the UN position. Whether it's right or wrong is another matter. In the government program of development of agriculture and regulating of agricultural markets, which has been extended to 2025, there's another goal set, achieving export growth from one infantile disorder of import substitution. We moved on to another infantile disorder, export expansion. Infantile disorders are to be had in childhood. If you have an infantile disease in your adult life, it can be mortal and fatal. Measles is not dangerous when you are a child. We get measles, and that's fine. So something you should go through. In the May decrees of the President of Russia, the government set a task of having $45 billion worth of agribusiness sector. And now people are racking their brains about how to achieve this goal. Goal setting is not an economic task, it's a political task. If the society decided that Russia should grow mammoths in Siberia and sell their meat abroad, it's a national choice. It's not for an economist to debate. The task of an economist is how to grow those mammoths and start exporting their meat. Therefore, I'm not discussing here this goal of $45 million worth of exports. The purpose of my presentation is about the risks on the way of achieving this task and that are under-discussed politically. Number one, as a great expert, leading expert in global supply chain and value chains, global food chains is not about monopoly. We don't understand them. They're not monopolies. You can call them venoms. These are not monopolies. That's the way the markets are. To understand what happened in agrarian markets, we should understand that, number one, the consumer change. We went through urbanization. Now, over 1/2 of the people are living in cities. Urban consumers are not rural consumers. Urban consumers need food from supermarkets, packaged, washed, processed. They eat in eateries, in restaurants, unlike the rural population. And they need a different product. requirements for the quality of food have gone up drastically. The world is concerned not only with safety, but the quality. Food should be high quality. Today's report, not today's, but recent report of FAO on Eurasian continent about healthy food states a unique fact that in Europe, with the high quality of life, for the past 25, anemia has gone up. It's veganism, as vegetarianism is concerned about the quality of food. In Russia, 4% of anemia for the same period of time, 10% in Asia overall. In the European Union, 38% growth in anemia in this well-to-do European Union. Awareness. Consumers know so much about food products, what elements are there. It's not about 1940 Andre. Today's consumer know everything about micronutrients, the origin of food, that it's dangerous to eat potatoes from Bryansk, but better from Ivanovo region. We have new producers. We have a different kind of a producer with new technologies, absolutely new. We're not able to control them. We don't know what is genetically modified food. Even the word GMO is bringing together a host of products. And the experts tend to laugh when it's a kind of a three-letter scarecrow or chemistry. We don't know how these chemicals affect us. And agriculture as a sector has disappeared. There's no such sector. Agriculture is part of the food supply chain. There's no such sector as agriculture. What is agriculture without those who supply resources, without those who buy those resources? All companies are existing in one single space. There are new products coming to market. We say grain. There is no such product. There's no such product as corn. There's corn for animals. What is coffee as a product? Arabica, Robusta, Jamaica, Blue Mountain. That's we knew in the past. Now consumers come to a shop, they say, I want Vietnamese, I want a new product. At the first stage of processing, that's a host of coffees, packaged this way, roasted this way. Since the product is not homogeneous, it has heterogeneous markets, different markets, and various markets. Price for corn. What corn? The ones in cans or the ones you feed to livestock? Classical theories do not work well in these markets, which was said yesterday. We have now functional food, food for athletes, food for pregnant women, food for children. And to deal with all of this, to cope with all of this, in our understanding, an exporter is an agricultural company, produced corn, agreed with somebody, and now they transfer it or carry it. Like port, one has to have such a detailed knowledge of mechanism in markets. And this lack of understanding that results in global food chains doing food trade. That's a classical OECD picture. What is food products? That's country A supplying commodities or input materials to country B that country B processes and exports. Country A can buy something else from country B, process and also export. country A can process and supply a ready-made product to country B or semi-manufactured. Food is a global supply chain, and they make countries so interdependent that we have gone through so many ruptures of production links. We understand that there's always danger and threat for food security.
And this is another picture from OECD, and the blue indicates the final product, or rather it's the gray that indicates the final product, and the blue stands for intermediates. So we can see some growth here in the trade in intermediate products. So there is no single net importer or single net exporter. And across this entire space, Russia, with its export strategy, is implicit. You cannot find it in any of the documents. But speaking about those measures that we want to implement to achieve President's goal, you will see that we want to create our own supply chains and become sovereign entrants in those markets. There is no such company as called Cargill. It's called Cargill. So we want to create our own Cargill. We want to create our own Dreyfus. We want to compete with them. But the thing is, if you're late at a market, you're already late. You need to move forward. They've been there 100 years, and we are only coming to that market, and we're trying to squeeze them out or find our own share. Let me speak briefly about where we can see that. We can see a sharp growth of expenses in support of exports, about 40 or more than 40 billion rubles a year. That's 100 times more than what is being spent now. A lot of countries are doing export support, but Argentina, for example, they have already achieved the level of 45 billion of agrarian export. They never supported exports. They actually taxed it. That was the main source of fiscal revenue for the country. And nevertheless, they were able to enter those markets. Then where do they want to send the 40 billion? First of all, the money will be spent on the so-called investment credits so that the market could absorb the money. We are going to distribute those 40 billion rubles across various regions. Komi, Tver, Yakutia, they need to produce something to become eligible for those 40 billion rubles. And at the most recent expo, the Gold Autumn, one of the representatives from Siberia said, we've done a major progress. We've been sending chocolate-coated bagels to China. That shouldn't become the symbol of Russian agrarian export. But that is simply because those regions need to include something in their KPI, and so that's what they did. Instead of becoming parts of global chains, and that's what the rest of the world is doing, investing in the creation of an overall environment. And at MGIMO, the International Relations Institute, they opened a master degree program on world agrarian markets, agricultural markets, because they're going to be prepared attachés that would be looking at what the situation is on the agricultural markets. And, for example, sitting there in Egypt, they would say, this is kind of grain that they need there in Egypt. That's what you need to take there. But the situation has been changing over the recent years. Where did you find those attachés in the old days? In the United States, Holland, and other countries. That's where we were importing food from. not where we are sending it. It's only recently that we've started having those attachés in the countries where we are exporting. And this is going to be my last slide. I'm moving over to the main thought of my presentation. This policy of using up the 40 billion rubles, we have three types of risks that we will have to deal with. The first one is the economic risk. When we support production, and let's say we say, let's produce more pork, and I'm not talking about this in the context of Islamic financial, just as a general goal of importing more of pork. Let's build more facilities to produce pork. What if we didn't succeed in doing this? Political risks, climatic risks, or any other risks. Let's say we decided to export pork at government's expense, at our own expense. We essentially have contributed to building more facilities, meatpacking facilities. All of this pork will go to the local domestic market, and we'll see surplus production. The producers will go bust because the prices will be too low. There are social risks as well, and it is clear, at least to the economists here, that if we are exporting certain things, that there is a risk that this may lead to an increase of domestic prices. I'm showing here eggs and sugar. That's where exports are growing rapidly. And you can see the index of prices in red and exports in blue. But you need to look at the causal reasons. The exports may grow because the domestic prices had fallen below the world prices. And as soon as the prices start changing, we'll have to support exports. And hopefully we're going to be able to export more to improve the living standards of Russian citizens, because I don't see any other reasons why we would do this. But we could see the reduction in domestic consumption because of the changes in the prices. And finally, there are environmental risks. When you produce and export something at any cost that doesn't meet the Sustainable Development Goal, and that's something that Russia subscribed to, and President Putin put his signature under it. The Kamchatka crab is the species that they only allowed to start catching again back in 2013 after 5 years of a ban, and this crab is one of the most expensive type of exports. So that means that by 2024 we'll achieve those goals, catch everything, and be without a crab, and we'll have to essentially introduce a new ban. Or let's take the sunflower. Sunflower oil is one of our export products, and in some regions we are at the level which is a critical level when you have too much of the sunflower in what we grow. And in some areas, like the Volga region, we have exceeded those norms. If we build a couple of more of livestock farms in Belgorod, you would generate too much manure. And what's going to happen with our resort areas? And I'm not saying that this is something that will definitely happen, but I'm talking about this as an economic type of a risk. So we need various tools, be that Sukuk or other tools. We need to consider them, but whenever we look at the strategy for exporting agricultural products, there are other problems, acute problems, that have to be handled, but they haven't yet been handled at the government level. That completes my presentation. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Evgenia. Thank you, Evgenia. And maybe in the context of this discussion, it is important to articulate a couple of points that I heard in your presentation. First of all, we're talking about essentially building relations, establishing relations in creating a supply chain for our consumers, and there are no contradictions here. We are getting this supply chain integrated into our relations with the consumers, and that is something that is a matter of a discussion today. And as for our consumers, we see Islamic countries, Middle East countries as such consumers for our grain products, where we have certain growth potential. and where we have made some inroads. And it is this region that we find very important. Can we increase our exports in other areas to reach that target of 40 billion so that we can enter the confectionery sector in Great Britain or enter the pasta business in Italy? We cannot say that we already see something tangible there. Maybe there's a principal potential, but I'm not sure that in France, Germany, or Italy, and other great countries, they are really waiting for us there with these deep processed products, although there may be some niche products, and the ham from Tambov can go to Italy. Can I make a brief comment? If we start exporting grain and cover the demand of all of the Islamic countries with grain, we would still not going to be able to use up 40 billion rubles worth of exports. And if we need to reach that number, we needn't just send our grain to Egypt. But if you send, let's say, grain to Egypt, we're not going to be able to make 40 billion rubles. Okay, estimates are possible, but we can produce 200 million tons, and our domestic demand has been satisfied, and we're exporting, let's say, 30 million tons. That means that we can easily, or at least with some effort, we could sell an additional 70 million tons. Can I ask you a question? Where are those 40 billion going to be coming from? Where did the number come from? But does the person who said this number understand anything about the agriculture? That's not the person who really writes those numbers down. That's what scares me. We see those slogans, and these numbers are a slogan which is an unfounded slogan, whether it's 2 billion or 200 billion. It is important to create mechanisms, to establish relations, and do the market penetration. And it's a very good conversation we are having. And I would like to continue this discussion with you. What difference does it make how many billions it's going to be? And well, that's something that Putin told us. Well, I'm not discussing the goals set by the president. I'm just indicating what are the risks that we may encounter as we implement this. That is true. That may be true. But most of the players are not thinking about those goals set by the president. They are operating within the realms of the law. And that's it. They are achieving their own goals. They are now being made to enter into those agreements. And 40 billion is just a number. I think we are well behind schedule. I would like to give the floor to Andrei, and then we'll have another speech on monopolies by Mr. Tsiganov. Very brief comment, if I may. Here's the deal. If we are to look at the existing production and supply chains, and if we look at them as something that is set once and for all, we will be breaching two important things. That means that we'll never going to be able to fit in, and the margin that will be generated is not something that we generate, and that is something that will make us very weak and marginal players. We need to build new ones to be highly marginal from the economic standpoint. And the second point I would like to make is that all of these chains, as we move to the new technological and economic cycles, are going to be destroyed. And if we just, idolize them, nothing is going to happen, obviously. We have one more speaker from the city of Leuven, from the Catholic University there, Johan Swinen. He is an expert in the field of supply chains. The floor is yours. Let's talk about those chains.
Thank you very much. Can I control my slides myself? Or? Thank you for inviting me to this panel at the Higher School of Economics. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I feel a bit reluctant because I'm surrounded by people who know much more about Russian agriculture and Russian food exports than I know myself. So I have taken a bit of a broader perspective. I'm going to present a couple of numbers. And given the fact that it is already quite late, I'm just going to point at a couple of issues which I think may be important for Russian exports in the future. So here is, I was part of a team which made an analysis about the Eurasian food security situation last year for the Eurasian Center for Food Security here in Moscow. And so some of my comparisons are based on that report. So what you see here is that basically it's the share of imports and exports. These are 2016 data. As compared to the agricultural protection. And you see that Russia has the highest both exports and import as a percentage of its agricultural production, more than other countries in the region. What is interesting also, if you look at this one, and so the thick red line is Russia here, is that the variation, the volatility in this share is really high. It's much higher than in other countries. And these are data for the last basically 25 years. Okay? And so you see that this has fluctuated tremendously over this period, even over the last 10 years. And there was already an issue raised by one of the speakers about the volatility of exports, and I think that's an important issue to think about. A supplier of a food product, for example, grains, which is really important for the stability of a country. If we look at cereal trade there, the line is much more stable, okay, which from that perspective is good, in the sense that since 2000, really, there's been an upward line with a very clear positive trade balance in cereals, which I'm sure you all know very well. If we do look at what's the production potential, which is also refers also to the export potential, obviously, then we see this is a study where we compared, we looked at the three major grain producers and grain exporters in this part of the world, which is Kazakhstan, Russia, and Ukraine. All the red lines are for Russia. And so there has been speculation that these countries, particularly because so much land was idled in the 1990s, could be reused for production of grains. And so here you see that there has been an increase again in land use, a bit, much more rebound in fertilizer use, which has led to significant growth in yields over the past decade. Climate change is very particular for this part of the world because in most of the south of the world, climate change is going to reduce yields, but here it has a mixed effect depending on because Russia is such a big country, in what part of Russia. There's been a number of complicated models which have tried to combine all this input to kind of predict for the future how much Russia and Ukraine and Kazakhstan could produce on grain. This is for wheat only, okay? So this is not for all grains. And so basically in this paper what we did, we basically looked at all these different predictions and we tried to come to kind of a consensus among the models. And they show that production could roughly be 25% higher than it was in the base period, taking into account intensification of fertilizer use, reuse of some of the land and climate change factors, okay? And so I think because most of this is going to be exported, I guess because the consumption in Russia will not increase significantly, that's a very significant growth in export, which is still possible. If we then look again here, this is a bit of older data. This is from a study from FAO, but there, and this is mostly related to the situation in let's say from 2000 to 2010. And there, the volatility of exports of Russian, this is mostly grains, is very high. And this again, if we think about political stability, being able to rely on grain, either for the financing, as we heard about the Islamic finance model, or just for having the food rail, that is something to be concerned about. But again, this is older data, which may be much better for the future. Then something about these global value chains. So what is the difference between just the trade and the value chains? It's actually the organization, the institutional organization of how trade is taking place, all the companies that are involved. Okay, and a key point which has also been made by some of the speakers, particularly also the previous one, is they are demand-driven. So you have to look at what do consumers want or what do governments want if governments are the main importers. And so there you have to, what I refer to as standards, which are basically requests that consumers make or companies which are importing, food companies. So that's private standards or public regulations. Think about food safety standards, think about pesticide use, etc., which are done by the government. Now, this is nothing new, okay? If you go back in the oldest books that exist in the world, there's talk about standards, and that's because if you want to trade, you have expectation on how the product looks. What is new is the amount and the extent of the standards. And so left is a panel, it's the growth of SPS notifications to the WTO, so it's an indicator of public regulations. On the right-hand side, this is global GAP, and GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practice. This is now standards which are used by supermarkets essentially in the world. And so there also you see that these standards are really growing very fast, okay? And so that's something you have to certainly take into account if you think about an export strategy for the future. Now, there is a big discussion among trade specialists that said, like, well, some of these standards are indeed for good reasons, okay, to protect consumers against bad food, etc. But some of these are just introduced as basically to protect markets, to protect producers, not to protect consumers, okay? And they call this non-tariff barriers. And this has grown since many countries have now become part of the WTO agreement and therefore cannot use the traditional import tariffs anymore, okay? This is just a press clipping from demonstrations in Europe where they basically are saying, well, we cannot have a trade agreement with the United States because they will undermine our food standards, okay? So this is data from a report we just did for the European Parliament. And so there we have on the left-hand side is basically complaints which have been submitted by some countries against some of these standards which have been introduced by other countries. And on the right-hand side is whom has submitted these complaints. And you see that the European Union and the United States are on top of both the list. Okay, so they submit most of the complaints, but they also get most of the complaints against them. Russia is not in the top 10 here. Indonesia is, Brazil is on some of these elements as well. Okay, in this case, Russia did take an active part. This deals with private standards. Okay, this is also was at the WTO. So China, India, South Africa, Brazil, Russia, Egypt, and Pakistan asked for regulations on private standards, essentially. Okay, and they claim that some of these private standards are basically protective instruments. Okay, and essentially the countries which are using a lot of these, the US, they say, well, the government has nothing to do with it, so WTO should not rule on this thing. These are by nature private initiatives. Okay. But obviously, if all the supermarkets have these same standards, the difference between private and public becomes blurred. This is if you want some good news. So despite the very strong increase in this private standard, they affect particularly things like vegetables and fruit export. You see there's been tremendous growth over this period of, these are horticultural export from Africa, Asia, Latin America is that, okay, over the same period. So it's not that trade is growth is no longer possible, it's just that this is really important to take into account. Just skip this one. So in terms of these global value chains, we know that they can contribute to the technology transfer, the productivity increase, also the farm income growth. We've known that from a number of studies we've done. Often this comes through these contracting systems which have been developed in these chains. We have, in the case of Russia, there is a number of studies, case studies, also for the grain sector, which have been done prior to 2005, but since then very little work has been done there, analytical work. So I think that's clearly an area where the new Agrarian Institute can work on this higher school of economics, but I think it's really important to understand how all these systems, also the relationships you talked about, work. Okay, I'll just end with one slide which is not about grains or not about Russia, it's actually from cotton in Kazakhstan, but it's a very interesting case why you see that from 97 until basically 2005 there was very strong growth in cotton production in Kazakhstan. And the reason is because that's when private sector developed, and with them contracting system, like pre-financing system, where the companies were paying the farmers upfront part of the deal to buy seeds, etc. Okay, And then in 2006, the Kazakhstan government basically introduced a rule that made these contracting systems illegal. And the consequence has been that although the profitability in the way has not changed because the prices have not changed, but the way this contracting, these value chains was no longer possible, the pre-financing, and as a result it has gone down. Okay. So that's just an illustration of how these things. So let's leave it at that.
Спасибо большое, Johan.
Thank you very much, Johan. That was a very interesting talk about the food chain, and we can hear from this food chain that a major role in these food chains is played by companies that control them through private standards, and they are the factors, or rather they are barriers to entry into the markets, and that will drive how we are going to shape our strategy for integration. And back in 2015, our team, as part of the BRICS group, we helped prepare a report on the global supply chains, and this is going to be published soon at Oxford University Press. And we analyzed the operation of these chains there, and we can see that there's a lot of monopolization there, and the main actors begin to control the markets through new tools, including private standards that you've indicated, because this is a very important element of control in this chain. That's why it's very difficult to penetrate those chains. And at this note, speaking about monopoly, I would like to give the floor to Andrei Tsiganov, who is the anti-monopoly expert. He deals with monopolies, oligopolies, and competition. And please, can you comment on what you've heard? Thank you very much. I will start with a number of comments, and then I will try to make a few positive statements. Speaking about this discussion that we've just seen unfold, it has been mentioned that everyone is playing according to their rules, and therefore the government should keep out and stay out. But in Russia, that's different, because in Russia, Russian agricultural product producers are dependent on the government support quite a lot, and therefore this creates certain dependence of the market participants on those decisions that the government makes. Further on, when we talk about consumers on the market, it seems to me that the image of a smart consumer that knows everything, that eats the proper food, who, after having moved from the urban rural area to the urban area, have started doing things properly and starts following the recommended daily allowance, using his apps. Yeah, that's not true. Not exactly true, because it doesn't correspond to the modern economic theories, because in many cases consumers make spontaneous decisions and doesn't select too many things, maybe 2 or 3. And it's also not essentially dovetailing with the fact that we have low-income people in our country that spend most of their disposable income on food, and they cannot select the best products for their food. And obviously,
and I would like to focus on the scenario where we'll have some peaceful development. Amidst mobilization economy, I think some problems may arise with global food markets, world food markets of a very serious nature. Problems of a very serious nature with regard to politics. Politics does exist in Russia, and a strategy exists in Russia, except priorities keep changing or are changing. And my point of view is that the existence of these strategic goals and through discussion of the sequence of actions, we succeeded in resolving the food security issue. We did resolve the food security issue in the Russian Federation. Any consumer is able to consume food products in sufficient amount. Dependence on imports along As per the overwhelming majority of food product items, I mean not resource or source products, and not means of accelerating the growth of animal husbandry or sunflower growth. Here we do depend, but our dependence on imports did go down. Now we have a chance to go into a next phase of agro-industrial complex development in Russia and to regain international food markets. And we have a government program for agricultural development and science and technological program for agro-industrial complex development. Both are in place and underway. And one of the national products that being implemented to implement presidential decrees, it's a product of international cooperation to boost exports. And one of the three major goals is to achieve $45 billion worth of food exports by 2024. That's a strategic goal, making use of many interdependent decisions, solutions, and tools, including funding the agro-industrial complex, creation of multilateral projects, and take into account various and huge risks involved with development of agro-industrial complex, starting from and with objective risks in a country where most of the territory is in permafrost region, and down to political risks relating to having or not having restrictive regimes in the international markets. All of this is a subject matter of this plenary session, and it appears that we have perhaps only started examination of this from all kinds of perspectives. A few substantive points. When we talk about this task of Russia's entering world food markets, it's not about pouring grain, butter, crabs, or chocolate, anything worthy of experts, but to gain one's reasonable share, rather, in the supply chains and chains of for the transfer of various phases of goods to expand production in Russian industrial complex. And in my view, the farther away from a farm or a field one can trace and track the good or influence the channels for its supply, the better for the Russian economy. For the greater share of its added value we can have and claim to have. One theme and one of the key issues in agro-industrial complex is infrastructure. This number of bottlenecks in handling, transportation, storage, and primary and not and secondary processing of Russian food products is huge. A huge number of bottlenecks, and except the national projects which are underway are to remove those, not only with regard to agro-industrial complex, but for instance, a comprehensive program for infrastructure development, which is one of the priority national projects that we have. What is the essence of this infrastructure development? We should quickly bring together these batches of agri-foods, deliver them to consumption places, ensure there's safe storage. Talking about experts, all of this should be done. These products should move quickly, well stored, not only and safely stored, not only inside Russia, but in international transportation corridors. And it turns out that infrastructure development issue, logistics issue, is acquiring an international nature and kind of intermodal nature. And it would appear that the projects we started our discussion with are quite important and interesting. And they're aiming at including some international component into development of the Russian agro-industrial complex. With regard to input resources and sources of various kinds for Russian agriculture, for Russian farmers and agriculture enterprises and companies, to make them cheaper. That's not the only or most important part. They should have transparent and non-discriminatory access for these products to what is necessary for the Russian agro-industrial complex. We in the antitrust service are giving a lot of attention to improving the tariff policy. Many journalists are calling this a tariff revolution because railway tariffs, oil price, gas price, greenhouses, tariffs, elevator price levels, and other regulated prices, including veterinary products, determine so much. And in our view, stock exchange and food exchange mechanisms are important to bring together producers and consumers. And secondly, what is more important for us, it's a mechanism making it possible, based on market conditions, to develop a reference price, so that this reference price for food products and input materials to be determined not overseas, but in the territory of Russian Federation. Also through organized trade and trading in commodity exchanges and other exchange platforms. I mean, oil and gas refining processes, gas and other products that are part of the supply chain or value chain in the agro-industrial complex. Funding, financing is a tool, is one of many on multiple factors that one should bear in mind, defining and determining strategic goals for the agro-industrial complex and its expansion into the world markets. But financing, based on how we at this round table are looking at this issue, is not just only getting money or getting any preferential treatment that allow us to make money that we access cheaper, that we get from the banks. It's about integration of international projects that go beyond Russia's borders. And that's the gist and the benefit and use of the mechanism which are under discussion today. It's using these partnership cooperation models that our report is based on. The team of experts of HSE has prepared. One should not forget about unconventional perhaps, methods and forms of boosting export potential for Russian high added value and not only primary commodities. For instance, gaining reputational advantages by Russian exporters, potential or current, related to long-term, reliable delivery of products for international chains operating in Russia. I mean, not so much international traders that are mentioned in the HSE report, A, B, C, D plus G. But for instance, trade chains and retail chains operating in Russia, also overseas companies operating in the food sector of Russia or in catering sector, eateries, restaurant business. I think it is this resource that is being underutilized in our projects to expand our presence in international markets. I mean, the presence of Russian food products and other high added value products. Another important task with which we can speak so much about a lesser dependence of Russia, the behavior of world players, which we cannot impact. That's the input materials for Russian agriculture. Chicken embryos and seeds and hybrids of agricultural crops are being purchased primarily outside of Russia. One cannot speak about independence of Russian agro-industrial complex or its stable penetration or expansion into world markets. It's impossible to talk about it. And the task of reducing Russia's agro-industrial complex on non-Russian agro-technical or genetic material has been set by the Russian president in the president's decree on the major areas and directions of competition development. What's the link between competition and foreign genetic material or seeds? Without Russia having its own agro-technical solutions, Russia's own selection and genetic accomplishments, Russian agriculture cannot become competitive worldwide. Speaking about the roadmap to develop enhanced competition, which was developed according to the Russian President decree and was developed by the ministry, a lot of measures approved by the Russian government last year deal with and include specific measures to overcome this dangerous dependence. There are practical mechanisms that are put in place to resolve this issue, not without participation of this wonderful university we are in. Alexei Ivanov, sitting next to me, is one of the managers of the Center for Technological Transfer. It was selected by the Russian antitrust authority to approve Bayer-Monsanto deal. And its aim is to have Russian accomplishment in selection and genetics, achievements and accomplishments, to make them available to potential competitors of Bayer, competitors of Monsanto, Syngenta, DuPont, China Gem, for new companies to appear here, for these technological solutions to be used by existing players in Russian agro-technical markets, not to have a complete dependence of Russian agro-technical business from non-Russian and not always available resources because of this restrictive measures, which are quite often used. Today's discussion has shown the importance and extreme importance of rules. Clearly, Islamic financing support measures for agro-industrial complex boosting and incentivizing exports on the part of Russian food producers should be based on certain rules and norms. These rules should be transparent, they should be non-discriminatory, they should be reasonable from the point of view of economics, they should be right, and in terms of rules of business, they should meet the standards existing in Russia. This applies to access to financial funding resources, to mechanism of state support for agriculture and agro-industrial exports in particular. This applies to access to infrastructure facilities inside Russia and beyond. And hopefully this will happen later. In my view, when we talk about, for instance, methods of the so-called Islamic financing, there's an important task of correctly fitting these projects into business and cultural milieu, existing cultural milieu. They should be perceived by the business community and ordinary users, consumers, not some exotic methods to cheat, to deceive, but as normal methods and rules of conducting business. I think it's no less important task than choosing the right projects or options for financing those projects. And the final comment, which may be seen as a departure from conventional, traditional Chicago school-imbued concepts of what competition is, about what is perfect competition. I think a political task and a business task is to overcome atomization of the Russian agri-industrial complex. Recently, in the antitrust agency, we had to count the number of agro-industrial companies, farms, producing commodity grains, not to feed chicken, but to deliver it to the Russian market. We have almost 100,000 grain producers. Why am I saying this? Having the way we have our market organized this way, this applies to sunflower, to meat, except some of the companies, which I will not name to advertise them. As long as we have this kind of organization of agriculture in Russia, it will continue to be like a plankton in value-added chain, down below in the food chain. We are facing with this absolute market power issue. Those who supply, from whom the agri-industrial complex buy what they need, technological solution, fertilizers, or leased land, and the absolute market power of those to whom they sell the products of the Russian agriculture. Alexei Ivanov mentioned that wonderful, remarkable book that will come out this year, which says that there's a limited number of companies in the input stage ready to provide technological solutions. The number of companies ready to provide technological solutions is diminishing. Companies that are ready to supply seeds, ready to supply genetics and selection solutions, their number is going down. Plant protection methods, the number of companies is reducing. Concentration on simple fertilizers markets or oil refining markets. You know so much about market concentration. And on the other hand, this atomized and fragmented agricultural complex is faced with retail change, major translational companies involved in commodities or any input materials, buying them at the very initial stage, even before this grain is sowed.
It is very clear that certain measures aimed at consolidating and rebalancing the market powers and the negotiating position of the Russian agribusiness and those who are against it, who are its opponents, as counterparts, is another very important and pressing task. And that completes my talk. Thank you very much. Let me make a couple of comments. And I think Andrei has made a few very important points as well. It's important for us to keep them in mind as we work to improve our paper and as we work to improve those mechanisms that have been proposed. He said that we need to look at the global value chains. That's very important, and indeed we have been working with those chains very carefully, even before that became really relevant. We worked with the Duke University, with the Gerefe back years ago. So we're not really novices to this topic, but we can see that as we analyze those food chains, that our producer is in a vice. And we are being asked, why are you doing work on grain selection, or why are you doing trade? And these are all different things, plus you're doing information things. Why don't we do this part or do the other part? And if you are doing trade, why not just concentrate on that? But this is because these are all links in the same chain. If you don't do one thing, then you will see competition in another area. And so this report that we did on selection is something that also had relevance for the Bayer-Monsanto deal and the Monsanto deal and merger and the work that the BRICS companies did. We looked at the technological part, which is the upstream. This is where the factor of production is coming from. And this is the downstream. And this downstream is equally important for our producers of the agri-products. My colleague here spoke about the environmental risks. And when we essentially do what we do, we are selling our land too cheap. And if we are not integrated into the global market and we don't get access to the consumer, and if we don't build our own capability in improving our genetic selection work, then we'll see essentially some idling, and we'll see some stagnation that would result in really bad consequences, similar to how we dealt with the aluminum problem in the 1990s. And this is the kind of business we have in our agriculture. We have to recognize this. We're using the tolling model. We are buying others' grain, other agrochemistry, others' information technologies, and we're selling it to other intermediaries, such as Cargill, although there are 11 ways to pronounce the name of this company. This is an Irish name, and there are 11 ways to pronounce it. And I'm sure even these sounds are different. And you probably need to play a fiddle or something, or a flute. So this Cargill and Dreyfus, and who else? Bunge, they are the ones that take the margin. They work with the consumers, but we need to work with the consumers as well. I would like to thank you, Andrei. And Andrei Bezrukov wanted to say a couple of words, and then we'll have two more presenters, and I will ask Evgeny to wrap up our session later on. Dear colleagues, I really cannot contain myself because I have to comment